The morning of the auction, there were 50 goats nobody wanted. They stood crowded together in the last pen at the far end of the county sale barn, the pen where the auctioneer put the animals he expected to give away rather than sell. And they were a poor sight even by the standards of that corner. They were the wild kind, the scrub kind, the sort that had come down off the back of some abandoned ridge property after the old man who owned them died and nobody claimed the herd for 2 years. Their coats were matted and burred, their hooves were long and split, and half of them had horns that grew in whatever direction they pleased. They were thin through the flank and wide through the eye, and they did not like people, and they let everyone know it by pressing themselves into the corner and stamping and swinging those crooked horns whenever a hand came near the rail. The men who filled the folding chairs that morning looked at them the way you look at a broken thing somebody has propped up, hopefully by the road with a sign that says free. When the auctioneer got to the lot, he did not even bother to work his rhythm. He just said, "Well, here they are, 50 head of whatever this is, who'll start me?" And the barn laughed, and a big man in the third row named Harlan Doss said loud enough for everyone, "You couldn't pay me to haul 'em off." And that was when the girl in the back raised 2 fingers. She was 22 years old, and she had walked in wearing her grandmother's canvas coat. And she did not raise her hand high or wave it. She just lifted 2 fingers off her knee, and the auctioneer squinted and said, "We got $2. $2 from the young lady. Anybody 2 1/4?" And the barn laughed again because they thought it was a joke, and Harlan Doss turned all the way around in his chair to look at her. And nobody bid against $2 for 50 animals nobody wanted, and the gavel came down, and she owned them. And Harlan Doss said, "Honey, you just bought yourself the biggest mistake in this county," and he had meant it as a prediction of failure. It had turned out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If you're the kind of person who has ever been told that what you have isn't worth much, do me a favor before we go on. Tap the like button and leave a comment telling me the name of the town you're watching from, because I read every single one of them, and I want to know where in the world this story is landing. Now, let's begin. Her name was Della Rourke, and she had come back to the mountain in March, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that felt like it belonged to her. Her grandfather, Emmett Rourke, had died in January, and the little farm at the head of Coldwater Hollow had come to her by way of a will that surprised everyone, including her mother, who had spent 30 years telling anyone who would listen that the Rourke place was 140 acres of rock you couldn't grow a headache on. Della had grown up 2 counties over in a rented duplex behind a car wash, and she had spent every summer of her childhood at the Hollow because her mother needed somewhere to send her. And those summers were the only stretches of her life she remembered as whole. She remembered the porch and the smell of it, and the way the fog sat in the low field until 9 in the morning, and the way her grandfather never said much but always seemed to be listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. When she was small, she had asked him once why the pasture below the barn was so green when everything higher up was brown by August, and he had looked at that patch of ground for a long moment and said, "There's water there that doesn't want to be found." And then he had gone back to whatever he was mending and never explained it, and she had forgotten it for 15 years. She was alone at the Hollow now. The house had power and a leaking roof over the back bedroom, and a wood stove that heated 3 rooms if you fed it right, and there was a barn that leaned a little to the east, the way old barns do when they've decided which way the weather usually comes from, and there was the great aunt. That was the one thing about the place her mother had never mentioned, that Emmett's sister still lived up there. Her name was Verna, and she was 86 years old, and she lived in a smaller house across the creek that Emmett had built for her when her own husband passed, and she wore men's work boots and a wool cap in all seasons, and a barn coat that had faded to no color at all, and she wore these things without any self-consciousness at all, because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm. Verna did not welcome Della with tears or with talk. She came across the footbridge the second morning, looked at her for a while, and said, "You got his eyes and none of your mother's foolishness. We'll see if that holds." And then she went back across the creek. That was the extent of it. But every few days she came and she watched, and Della learned that Verna's silences were not empty. They were full of things she was deciding whether to say. The land itself was what the county had always said it was. It was steep. It was stony. The good bottom ground was maybe 6 acres, and the rest climbed away in ledges and thickets and old logging scars grown up in briar and cedar and the kind of scrub brush that takes over land nobody's tending. There had been cattle on it once, in Emmett's father's time. But cattle need grass, and grass needs flat, and there wasn't enough flat, and the herd had dwindled and gone, and the brush had come, and the brush had won. By the time Della arrived, you couldn't walk half the property without a machete, and the upper fields that her grandfather had described to her as pasture were now solid green walls of multiflora rose and honeysuckle and autumn olive, all of it thorned or tangled or both, all of it choking out anything a person might actually want to grow. Della spent her first 2 weeks just trying to understand what she had. She walked the boundary with an old plat map that had been folded so many times it had worn through at the creases, and she filled a spiral notebook with observations, and she came back to the house each evening scratched to the elbows and no closer to a plan. The land was worth nothing. Everyone agreed, and she owned it entirely, and she had almost no money, and the only thing she'd managed to acquire since arriving was 50 wild goats she'd bought for $2 on an impulse she could not fully explain even to herself. She had gone to the sale barn that Saturday for no reason except that Verna mentioned it and Della had nothing else to do. She had stood at the back and watched cattle sell and hogs sell and one nervous horse sell, and she had not intended to buy anything at all. But when they brought out that last pen, when she saw those 50 ragged animals pressed into the corner, refusing to be handled, refusing to be looked at, standing there being worthless in front of a whole barn of men who were sure of it, something in her went still the way it did when she was paying real attention. She looked at them for a long time. She noticed that they were not sick. Their eyes were clear, and their breathing was easy, and their coats, under the burrs, were thick. She noticed that they were not old. Most of them were young, 3 and 4 years, in the prime of whatever a goat's prime is. And she noticed the thing that the men in the folding chairs had counted against them, which was that they had spent 2 years fending entirely for themselves on a mountain, eating God knew what, drinking from God knew where. And they had not just survived it, they had thrived on it. They had bred and multiplied and gotten fat on ground that a cow would have starved on. They were not worthless. They were built for exactly the kind of place nobody wanted. She raised 2 fingers, and that was how it started. Getting them home was its own education. She borrowed a stock trailer from a neighbor named Cyrus Pruitt, who charged her nothing for it but stood there shaking his head the whole time she loaded. And it took her and Cyrus's grandson the better part of the afternoon to move 50 animals that did not want to be moved from one pen into that trailer. And by the end of it, she had a split lip and a bruise on her hip the size of a saucer, and Cyrus had lost his hat somewhere in the melee and never found it. When they finally got the trailer up the hollow road and backed it to the gap in the fence Della had spent 3 days patching, and when she dropped the tailgate, the goats did not mill or hesitate or wander cautiously out to inspect their new home the way she'd imagined. They exploded out of that trailer like water out of a broken dam, and they hit the brush at the bottom of the upper field, and they were gone, simply gone, swallowed up into the green tangle, and Cyrus laughed and said, "Well, there goes your $2. You'll never see half of them again." And Della stood at the fence and watched the brush swallow her whole herd, and she did not feel the panic she probably should have felt. She felt something closer to curiosity. She wanted to see what they would do. She got up before light the next morning and walked up to the fence with her notebook and she found them at the edge of the honeysuckle, and they were eating. That was the thing she had understood in the sale barn without being able to put words to it, and it was the thing that would change everything, though it would take a long time and a lot of watching before she saw the whole shape of it. These goats were not lawn mowers, and they were not livestock in the ordinary sense. They were, she came to realize over the following weeks, an appetite pointed precisely at everything her land was drowning in. They did not want grass. They walked right over the little grass she had. They wanted the multiflora rose. They wanted the young autumn olive, and the honeysuckle vine, and the poison ivy she couldn't touch, and the briar canes as thick as her thumb. They stood on their hind legs and pulled down the branches and stripped them clean. They pushed into thickets a person couldn't enter and came out the far side having eaten a path through it. And they were smart about it, and they were relentless, and there were 50 of them, and Della, standing at the fence each morning with her notebook, began to understand that she had not bought 50 worthless animals. She had bought 50 workers who did not want wages, who ate what she needed gone and who turned it, day by day, into more goats. She started keeping records. She wrote down where they worked and how fast and what they left alone. She fenced them into a section of the upper field with a length of portable electric netting Cyrus sold her cheap. And in 9 days they cleared a 1/4 acre so thoroughly that when they moved off it, she could see the ground for the first time in a decade. And she could see the old stone she remembered from childhood, the low tumbled wall her grandfather had said his own grandfather laid. Verna came across the bridge in the middle of April and found Della sitting on that newly exposed stone wall, filthy, watching the goats work the next section over. Verna looked at the cleared ground a long time. She looked at it the way Della had looked at the goats in the sale barn. And Della was beginning to understand that this was a family trait, this long silent looking before speaking. Then Verna said, "Your granddad tried to clear this field with a bush hog for 30 years, and it beat him every time. It always came back thicker." Della said, "They don't leave the roots exposed to grow back. They keep after it. They eat the shoots as fast as it sends them up." Verna nodded slowly and said, "So they do." And she looked at the goats a while longer. And then she said the thing that would turn out to matter, though she said it the way she said everything, offhand, plain, like it was nothing. She said, "Keep them on the same ground long enough, and they'll uncover more than you're expecting up here. This whole mountain used to be different before the brush took it. There's things under there your granddad remembered, and I've half forgotten." And then she turned and went back across the bridge, and Della wrote the sentence down in her notebook, the whole of it, "They'll uncover more than you're expecting," and underlined it, and did not yet know that she was writing down a prophecy. The spring turned toward summer, and Della fell into a rhythm that would have looked, to anyone watching, like a young woman slowly losing a fight with a mountain. She moved the netting every few days, herding the goats from section to section, learning their ways, learning which ones led and which ones followed, learning that they came when she rattled a coffee can of grain, even when they had refused to come for anything else. She named a few of them to spite herself. There was a big rangy doe with one horn curved down and one curved out that she called Compass. And there was a black buck that led the herd into every thicket first, testing it, that she called Scout. And there was a little cream-colored yearling that always leaned against her leg while she moved the fence that she did not name because she was trying to hold a line about not naming them. And she almost held that line. She herded, and she watched, and she wrote. And the county watched too, in its way, because in a place like Coldwater, there is no such thing as a private undertaking. Word got around that the Rourke girl had bought the worthless goats and turned them loose on the worthless land, and the men at the feed store had a fine time with it. Harlan Doss, who ran 400 head of Black Angus on the best bottom land in the valley, and who considered himself the final authority on all matters agricultural, said what everyone was thinking, which was that you can't make something out of nothing. That scrub is scrub and rock is rock, and that the girl would learn the hard way, what her granddad had spent his whole life learning, that some ground just isn't worth the trouble. Nothing useful comes from nothing useful, he said. And he said it more than once, and it got repeated around, and Della heard about it eventually the way you hear about everything in a small place, second-hand and softened, and she wrote that down too. Nothing useful comes from nothing useful. She looked at it on the page for a while. Then she went back to moving her fence. She had no income, and she had to solve that. And the first solution came from the goats themselves. In June, the does that had bred on the mountain the previous fall started dropping kids, and Della, who had never delivered so much as a kitten, found herself pulling wet, trembling kids out of the brush at all hours and carrying them down to the barn in the front of her coat. By the middle of the month, she had 31 new kids, and the herd that had cost her $2 was worth, even at scrub prices, real money on the hoof. But Della did not sell them for scrub prices, and this was the first sign that she saw the whole thing differently than the men at the feed store did. She had noticed in her weeks of watching that these animals were something people would want if they understood what they were, because a goat that clears multi-floor rows without complaint is worth a great deal to anyone with land going to brush, and there were a lot of people in those mountains with land going to brush. So she did not haul her kids to the sale barn to be laughed at again. She waited. She posted 3 photographs online, one of the goats mid-work in a wall of thorns, one of the cleared ground behind them showing the stone wall, and one of the little cream yearling looking straight at the camera. And she wrote a plain description of what these animals did and how they'd been bred by 2 years of pure survival to do exactly that. And she priced them at 4 times what the sale barn would have given, and she waited to be told she was a fool. The first message came in 11 days. It was from a man named Osgood who had 80 acres over in the next watershed that had gone entirely to autumn olive after his wife got sick and he couldn't keep after it. And he had heard, he said, that her goats ate the stuff. And was it true, and would she sell him 10? Della drove 10 kids over in Cyrus's borrowed trailer, and Osgood watched them go to work on his fence line within an hour of unloading, and he wrote her a check for the full asking price and shook her hand and said, "Where in the world did you find these?" And Della said, "The sale barn, $2 for 50. And Osgood laughed until he had to sit down. The second buyer heard about it from Osgood. The third heard about it from the second. Della never advertised again after those 3 photographs. She did not need to. Every animal she sold went to work in plain sight of neighbors who had their own brush problem, and every cleared fence line was an advertisement that ran itself. And by the time August came, she had sold 42 kids at a price that made the men at the feed store stop laughing and start frowning, because the frown is what a certain kind of man does when the thing he was sure was worthless starts turning a profit and he cannot understand why. She put the money in a coffee can, the same as her grandfather had, because she did not trust that it would last, and she wanted to be able to see it. And she kept moving her fence, and she kept writing in her notebook, and the mountain, section by section, began to come back into view. It was in the working of the mountain that she found the first of the things Verna had promised she would find. In the last week of August, the goats cleared a shelf of ground on the northeast face that Della had never even been able to reach on foot, a bench of land maybe an acre wide tucked under a stone ledge, and when the brush came down off it she found, half buried in leaf litter and old vine, the collapsed remains of a structure. It was small, dry-laid stone, 4 courses still standing on the uphill side, and at first she took it for another wall. But when she cleared the leaves away with her hands, she saw that it was rectangular and deliberate, a little building of some kind, and set into the floor of it was a stone trough, and the trough was cut, not cast, cut out of a single block of the mountain's own stone by somebody's patient hand a very long time ago. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. Then she went and got Verna. Verna came across the bridge and up the mountain slower than she used to move, but with no complaint, and she stood at the edge of the cleared bench and looked at the little stone building in the cut trough, and something moved across her face that Della had not seen there before. Verna said, "I hadn't stood here since I was a girl," and Della waited, because she had learned that Verna would say the rest when she was ready. Verna walked to the trough and put her hand flat on the cut stone and said, "This was the spring house," and Della said, "What spring? There's no water here." And Verna said, "Not now there isn't, but there was. There was the best water on this whole mountain, and your great-great-grandfather built this house over it to keep it cold and clean. And then something happened to it, and everyone stopped talking about it. And after a while, everyone forgot it was ever here at all." Della looked at the dry-cut trough where water had once run, and had not run in longer than anyone living could remember. And she felt the thing she had felt in the sale barn, the stillness of paying real attention. That night, Della went into the back room of the house where her grandfather's things were still boxed and stacked, and she began going through them properly for the first time. She had put it off, the way you put off going through the belongings of the dead, but Verna's words about the spring had lit something in her that would not settle, and she wanted to know what her grandfather had known. She found what she was looking for on the third night. It was a ledger, a wide flat account book bound in cracked black cloth, and in it, in her grandfather's small square hand, and in the hands of two men before him, were the records of the Rourke place going back more than 100 years. There were weather notes and calving dates and the prices of hogs sold in years so long past the money didn't mean anything anymore. And there were, threaded all through it, references to the spring. The upper spring, they called it, or sometimes the cold spring, or sometimes just the water. There was an entry from her great-great-grandfather's time, faded almost to nothing, that read, "Piped the cold spring down to the house, sweetest water in the county, keeps butter 3 days in July." There were entries about the spring house, about the trough, about a stone-lined channel that carried the water down the mountain. And then, in a different hand, her great-grandfather's, there was an entry from the spring of 1934 that made Della go still. It read, "Earthquake shook the mountain in the night, small one, no damage to buildings, but the cold spring quit by morning, ran muddy 2 days then quit, cannot find where it went." And after that the spring appeared no more in the ledger except once, years later, in her grandfather's hand, a single line that Della read over and over. It said, "The water is not gone, water does not leave, it only moves. Some day it will show itself again to someone who watches." She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the wood stove ticking, and she understood then what her grandfather had said to her when she was a child, standing over that green patch below the barn. There's water there that doesn't want to be found. He had not been speaking idly. He had spent his life watching for the water his father lost, watching the places where the ground stayed green in August, reading the mountain the way other men read the newspaper. And he had died still watching, and he had left the whole thing to her, the land nobody wanted, and the water nobody remembered, and the knowledge nobody else had bothered to keep. She copied his line into her notebook beneath Verna's line. Water does not leave, it only moves. She did not know yet how to find it, but she knew now that it was real, and she knew that her goats, working the mountain section by section, were doing the one thing that might reveal it, which was to strip away the century of brush that had hidden every clue. Autumn came to Coldwater Hollow, and the leaves turned and fell, and with the brush eaten low and the trees bare, Della could see the shape of the mountain for the first time. She spent the shortening days walking the cleared ground with her grandfather's ledger and her own notebook, looking for the things the old records described, the green places, the seeps, the stone channel. She found the channel first, or a piece of it, a line of set stones running downhill from the spring house that vanished into a place where the goats hadn't cleared yet, and she moved the netting to put them on that ground next, and in a week they'd opened it, and she followed the channel another 40 feet down the slope before it disappeared under a slump of earth. The mountain had moved, just as the ledger said. Some old slide had covered the channel and choked it, and the water, blocked, had done what water does. It had found another way, and it had gone somewhere no one could see. Della marked everything on the plat map. She marked the spring house and the channel and the slump, and she marked the green patch below the barn her grandfather had shown her, and she sat on the porch in the cold evenings and looked at the map and tried to think the way the water thought. The goats made her money that fall too, more than she had expected, because the word had kept spreading through the network of people who had land going to brush, and by October she had a waiting list. She sold a dozen animals to a man restoring an old orchard, and 8 to a woman clearing a homestead she'd inherited. And she began to understand that she had not stumbled into a one-time sale, but into a demand that would renew itself every year, because brush always comes back and people always need it gone, and her goats were bred better for the work than anything a person could buy elsewhere. She raised her prices again, gently, and no one balked, and she put the coffee can money into a real account at the bank in town, and the teller, who was Harlan Doss's niece, mentioned it to her uncle, because that is how a small place works, and Harlan Doss found out that the girl with the worthless goats had put more money in the bank in 6 months than some of the men who laughed at her cleared in a year. He did not say anything about it at the feed store. He got quieter about her instead, which is its own kind of statement. The first hard freeze came in November, and it was the freeze that showed her the water. She had noticed all fall that there was one place on the newly cleared mountain where the goats liked to bed down, a low spot below the old channel and off to the east of where she'd been looking, and she had noted it in her book without understanding it. On the morning after the first real freeze, she walked up to move the fence, and she saw that the whole mountain was white with frost. Every blade and stone rhymed hard, except for one patch, a rough oval maybe 30 feet across, where the frost had not formed at all, where the ground steamed faintly in the cold morning light, dark and green and warm against all that white. She stood and looked at it for a long time. She had learned to trust that stillness. She knew what she was seeing before she let herself say it. She walked to the center of the unfrosted ground and knelt and put her hand flat on the earth and felt that it was warmer than it had any right to be. And she pressed her fingers into the soil and felt that it was wet, saturated, though there'd been no rain in a week. The water had not gone. It had only moved. It had come down through the mountain along some hidden path and pooled here below the surface, patient, waiting, warm in the ground enough to keep the frost off, showing itself at last to someone who watched. She went and got Verna, and Verna came up the mountain and stood at the edge of the steaming ground and did not say anything for a very long while, and then she said, "Well, he told you, didn't he?" And Della said, "He told me." Verna nodded and looked at the ground where the water was and said, "Took 80 years and a herd of $2 goats, but there it is. Finding the water where it pooled and getting it to run clean and cold from a pipe were two different things, and the winter went into that work. Della hired no one because she could not afford to, and because she had come to prefer doing things with her own hands, but she did accept help, and the help came from an unexpected quarter. Cyrus Pruitt's grandson, the teenager who had helped load the goats that first day, a lanky, quiet boy named Wade who was good with tools and did not have much to do that winter, started coming up the hollow to work with her, and he was worth more than his weight in gold, because he could run a backhoe and Della could not. They rented a small excavator by the week, and following the ledger's descriptions and the steaming ground and the line of the old channel, they dug carefully into the slope above the pooled water until they hit the vein. It came up out of the ground when they broke through, not a trickle but a real flow, clear and shockingly cold, so cold it made your teeth ache, and it filled the hole they dug and ran over the lip and down the mountain, finding a path down the slope as if it had only been waiting to be let out, which it had. Della cupped her hands and drank it, and it was the sweetest water she had ever tasted, and Wade drank it and said, "That's better than what comes out of my tap." And Della said, "It's better than anything, And she was right, and she was about to find out just how right, though not the way she expected. They cleaned the vein and lined it with stone the way the old record said the springhouse trough had been lined, and they rebuilt the little stone building over it, Wade laying courses under Della's direction from the ledger's descriptions. And they ran a pipe down the mountain along the old channel's line, and by the time the ground thawed in March, a year after Della had come to the hollow, the cold spring ran again, ran down to the house and past it and out to a stock tank in the lower field, sweetest water in the county, just as it had run for her great-great-grandfather 100 years before. Della had done it for the water itself, for the finding of it and the honoring of what her grandfather had known, and she had not thought past that. She had a spring now, restored, running clean. She did not yet see it as anything but a wonder. It was Verna who saw the rest of it, Verna who came across the bridge one morning in April and filled a jar from the spring house and held it up to the light and looked at it and said, "People used to come from 3 counties for this water, back before the pipe, back before everyone forgot. They'd bring their jugs on a Sunday, and Della said, 'For water?' And Verna said, 'For this water, there's water, and there's water. And this is the kind people remember their whole lives.'" Della thought about that for a week. Then she took a jar of it to the man in town who ran the general store, a careful old man named Prentice, who knew everything worth knowing about what people would buy, and she asked him to taste it and tell her honestly what he thought. Prentice tasted it and set the jar down and looked at her and said, "Where's this from?" And she told him. And he said, "I remember your granddad talking about the Rourke Spring when I was a boy." I thought it was a story, and he tasted it again and said, "I'll take all you can bottle, and I'll pay you a fair price, and you won't be able to keep it on the shelf." Della had not thought of bottling it, but she looked at the jar on the counter and she felt the stillness come, the pain of attention, and she thought about the demand that had pulled her goat business into being without her ever advertising, and she thought about how the best things in that country move by word of mouth and memory. And she said, "All right, I'll bottle it." And Prentice said, "Start small, see what happens." And she did. She started very small. She did not take on debt. She did not build a plant or hire a crew or do any of the things a person with a grand plan would have done. She bought a case of glass bottles and a hand capper, and she filled the bottles at the spring house herself, and she put a plain paper label on them that said Cold Water Spring, Rourke Hollow. And beneath that, in smaller letters, she wrote a single true line, "Lost 80 years, found again." And she carried 24 bottles down to Prentice, and he put them on the counter by the register, and they were gone in 3 days. He called her and said, "Bring more," and she brought more. And those were gone too, and then people started driving up the hollow. That was the thing that surprised her, though by then she should have known better than to be surprised. People started driving up the hollow road with empty jugs the way they had in Verna's girlhood, because the story of the lost spring found again by the girl with the $2 goats had begun to move through the mountains the way water moves, finding every low place, and people wanted to taste it, and people wanted to stand where it came out of the ground, and people wanted, more than anything, to be part of a thing that had been lost and was found. Della had not sought a single one of them. She had only paid attention and done the work and let the worth prove itself. By the second summer, the hollow had 2 streams of money running through it, the goats and the water, and neither one had cost her anything but patience. The goats cleared the mountain and paid for themselves twice over, and their kids sold before they were weaned to a waiting list that never got shorter. And the water ran clean and cold, and Prentice could not keep it on the shelf, and neither could the 2 other stores that had asked to carry it. And the people came up the hollow with their jugs on Sunday afternoons, and Della let them, and asked for nothing, and most of them left money in a coffee can she set by the spring house without her ever mentioning it, because that is what people do when they've been trusted. She kept her records, she kept her notebook. She did not name the water business or the goat business, or make any ceremony of any of it. She just did the next thing, and then the next, and the whole enterprise grew the way the goats had cleared the mountain, section by section, no faster than it could sustain, pulled forward by demand, and never pushed by ambition. Harlan Doss came up the hollow in July of that second year. He came alone in the middle of a weekday, which Della understood was deliberate, because a man like Harlan Doss did not want an audience for what he had come to do. She was at the spring house filling bottles when his truck came up the road, and she straightened and waited, and he got out and stood by his truck for a moment, looking at the restored spring house and the goats working the far slope and the neat run of pipe down the mountain. And then he walked over and stood at the edge of the spring house and did not say anything for a while, which she had come to recognize as the sound of a man in that country arriving at something hard to say. Finally he said, "My daddy used to talk about the Rourke Spring," and Della said, "So did mine." And Harlan nodded and looked at the water running clear over the lip of the stone trough, and he said, "I told everybody you'd bought the biggest mistake in the county." And Della said, "I remember," and he did not flinch from it. He just nodded again and said, "I was wrong." And that was the whole of it. He did not make a large production out of it. He did not apologize in so many words or explain himself. He just stood there and said he was wrong and let it stand, which from Harlan Doss was an enormous thing. Then he said, "I've got 200 acres of ridge behind my place gone solid to brush, been gone 20 years. I always figured it was a loss." And Della looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "That's one approach." And Harlan almost smiled and said, "What would you do?" And Della said, "I'd put goats on it, and I'll sell you the goats, and I'll show you how to move the fence." And Harlan said, "All right." And he bought 40 animals from her that afternoon and paid full price and shook her hand. And as he was leaving, he stopped by the spring house and filled a jar and drank it. And he stood there a moment tasting it, and then he said, "My daddy was right. This is the best water in the county." And he got in his truck and drove back down the hollow, and Della watched him go, and then she went back to filling her bottles. Verna was failing by then. Della had watched it happen across the 2 years, the slowing, the way the walk across the footbridge took longer each month, the way she came less often and stayed for shorter times, and Della had known what it meant and had not spoken of it because Verna would not have wanted her to. In the third autumn, Verna stopped coming across the bridge, and Della went to her instead, every day, and sat with her in the small house Emmett had built. And Verna, who had spent her whole life economical with words, spent some of her last ones telling Della the things she had half forgotten and then remembered. The old ways of the mountain, where the other seeps were, which slopes the goats should never be left on in a wet spring. How her mother had lined the spring house trough with a particular clay to keep it sweet. Della wrote it all down. On one of the last clear afternoons, Verna asked Della to fill a jar from the spring and bring it to her, and Della did. And Verna drank it slowly, and then she held the jar in her 2 hands in her lap and looked out the window toward the mountain that had come back green and open under the working of the goats. And she said, "He'd have liked to see this, your granddad. He watched for it his whole life and never saw it, and you saw it in one." And Della said, "He saw it. He's the one who told me where to look." And Verna smiled at that, a small, tired smile, and said, "So he did." And she closed her eyes, and that was one of the last things she said. She died in her sleep before the first freeze, 88 years old, wearing the wool cap even in bed. And Della buried her beside Emmett in the little Rourke plot on the shoulder of the mountain, in ground the goats had cleared, where you could see the spring house from the graves. The morning of Verna's funeral, there was frost on the whole mountain except the oval of green where the water pooled beneath the ground, and Della stood at the grave and looked at that one warm, unfrozen patch across the slope. And she thought about how the water did not leave. It only moved, and she thought that maybe that was true of more than water. The county came to the funeral, all of it. The men from the feed store and Prentice from the general store and Cyrus and Wade. And Harlan Doss came in a clean shirt and stood at the back and did not say much. and afterward they all went up to the spring house without anyone suggesting it, and they filled their jars, and they drank the water Verna had loved, and it was the sweetest water in the county, and every one of them knew it. That winter, Della did the thing she had been building toward without ever calling it a plan, which was that she expanded. And she did it the same way she had done everything else, which was to say quietly and with patience and without borrowing a dollar. She had the goats and the water and 3 years of demand pulling at her, and she had Wade full-time now and 2 other young people from the Hollow who needed work and were glad to have it. And she put in a second spring house over a seep Verna had told her about on the north slope, and she doubled the bottling by hand, still with a paper label, and she never advertised, not once, because she did not need to, because the story carried itself and the water carried itself, and the goats carried themselves, and because she had learned from her grandfather and her great-aunt, and the ledger and the mountain itself, that the worth of a true thing does not need to be argued. It only needs to be revealed and then trusted to prove itself. 4 years after the morning, she raised 2 fingers in the sale barn, the Rourke place. The 140 acres of rock you couldn't grow a headache on, supported 5 families, and shipped water to 4 counties, and cleared brush across half the valley on the backs of goats descended from the 50 nobody wanted. And Della Rourke was 26 years old and had never once told anyone they were wrong about her, because she had never needed to. She kept her grandfather's ledger on the kitchen table, and she wrote in it now in her own hand, continuing the record the way 3 generations before her had, weather and kiddings, and the level of the spring. And beneath her great-grandfather's entry about the earthquake and her grandfather's line about the water that only moves, she had added a line of her own, dated the morning she'd knelt on the unfrosted ground. It said, "Found the water where he said it would be, in ground everyone had given up on, brought there by animals everyone laughed at," and she had not underlined it or made anything of it. She had just written it down and closed the book. On a morning in the 5th spring, she stood at the